El Salvador's prison system has been a subject of intense scrutiny due to the country's struggles with gang violence, corruption, and overcrowding. The story of El Salvador's prisoners is intertwined with the rise of powerful gangs, government efforts to contain them, and the difficult conditions that many inmates face in the country's overcrowded and understaffed prisons. The rise of gangs in El Salvador. To understand the situation of prisoners in El Salvador, it is crucial to grasp the rise of gangs in the country, particularly the notorious MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, and 18th Street gangs, Barrio 18. These gangs originated in the 1980s and 1990s, primarily in the United States, where Salvadoran immigrants facing difficult economic conditions in their home country began to form groups for protection. Over time, these groups became increasingly violent and expanded into El Salvador. By the early 2000s, they had gained a significant foothold in the country, where they became major players in organized crime, drug trafficking, and extortion. The gangs are known for their brutal tactics, including killings, kidnapping, and terrorizing entire communities. Their reach has extended far beyond the prisons, where they run their operations through a combination of intimidation, violence, and bribery. These gangs not only control the streets, but also the cells in which their members are imprisoned. Their influence in the country's criminal justice system has created a deep and dangerous problem for both the government and the people of El Salvador. Overcrowding and inhumane conditions. The increase in gang violence and criminal activity has put tremendous pressure on El Salvador's prison system. The country has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, with its prisons often operating far beyond their capacity. Many of these prisons were designed for fewer prisoners, but have seen numbers swell over the years, leading to overcrowded cells with dire conditions. Inmates often face inhumane conditions: inadequate food, poor sanitation, a lack of medical care, and the constant threat of violence. Some prisoners live in conditions so cramped that they have little room to move. The lack of basic necessities, such as clean water, is another ongoing issue. Prisoners are often forced to rely on family members to bring in food, water, and even medical supplies. In these overcrowded prisons, the gangs exert control over much of the day-to-day life. They often operate from behind bars, continuing to carry out criminal enterprises like extortion, drug trade, and even directing hitmen from within the prison walls. The authorities, struggling with limited resources, have found it difficult to control this powerful gang influence within the prisons. Government's war on gangs and the crackdown on prisoners. The government's response to the gang violence and control over prisons has been aggressive, with several crackdowns aimed at dismantling the gangs and taking back control. In 2015, President Salvador Sanchez Cerén launched a controversial program known as Mano Dura, Heavy Hand, which focused on increased police presence and the mass incarceration of suspected gang members. This program resulted in thousands of arrests, contributing to the severe overcrowding in El Salvador's prisons. However, while the intention of the government's efforts was to reduce gang violence and increase safety, the policy has also been criticized for its heavy-handed approach. Many argue that it led to a violation of human rights, with people being imprisoned without due process or evidence, and for the harsh treatment of inmates, many of whom were not involved in gangs. In 2020, President Nayib Bukele launched another aggressive campaign against the gangs, calling it Plan Control Territorial Control Plan. This plan included military operations, sweeping arrests, and efforts to eliminate gang leadership, including within the prisons. In response, the government also began to isolate gang leaders, moving them to maximum security prisons, where conditions were even more extreme. One of the most infamous developments in recent years occurred in 2022 when the government declared a state of emergency after a surge in gang violence. The authorities began to round up suspected gang members, and many were thrown into prison without formal charges or trial. Over 60,000 individuals were detained during this period, leading to further overcrowding. Many human rights organizations condemned this as a violation of civil liberties, and there were reports of abuse and torture in the prisons. Life inside the prisons. For those who are incarcerated, life inside the prisons can be grueling. Many prisoners, especially those affiliated with gangs, live in constant fear of attack from rival gangs or even from prison guards. Violence is a daily reality, and disputes between gangs often lead to deadly fights. Some prisons are known for being extremely dangerous places where survival is often a matter of aligning with the right group or maintaining a strict don't interfere stance. For gang leaders, prison is not a place of isolation, but an operational base. It is in these jails that many of the strategies for expanding and managing criminal enterprises are formulated. In fact, many gang members stay in communication with their criminal associates on the outside, continuing their operations. There have been numerous reports of prisoners organizing hits, extortions, and even drug shipments from within their cells. But it's not only gang members who suffer. Ordinary criminals, and even those wrongfully imprisoned for minor offenses, are often caught up in the prison's dangerous dynamics. For them, the challenge is to avoid being swept into gang activities or becoming a target for violence. International attention and reform efforts. The international community has increasingly focused on El Salvador's prison system. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented abuses in the prisons, including overcrowding, lack of access to health care, and abuse by prison staff. These organizations have called for comprehensive reform, not only in the treatment of prisoners, but also in addressing the root causes of gang violence, such as poverty, lack of education, and social exclusion. Reform efforts, however, have been slow and are often stymied by the entrenched corruption within the prison system itself. The prison guards, in many cases, are just as much a part of the criminal ecosystem as the prisoners, and there have been reports of bribery and collusion between prison officials and gangs. While the government has made some strides in improving conditions, including investing in new facilities, the system remains overwhelmed. Overcrowding, poor management, and a lack of resources continue to plague the prison system, making it difficult for meaningful reform to take place. Conclusion: the story of prisoners in El Salvador is one of suffering, survival, and violence. The rise of gangs has deeply affected the country's prisons, and the government's response to this crisis has often exacerbated the challenges. Prisoners in El Salvador face harsh conditions, with many enduring physical and psychological torment, while the gang influence within the system continues to dominate. The ongoing struggle between law enforcement and the gangs, combined with an overwhelmed prison system, presents an incredibly complex situation. It will. By MES Chat G Pi will agree to our terms and have read our privacy policy.